China did not betray Iran. That is the first thing you need to understand about what Beijing just did, because betrayal implies a commitment that was broken, a promise that was made and then violated, a relationship built on genuine solidarity that collapsed under pressure. And China never made that commitment to Iran, never made that promise, never built that relationship on anything resembling genuine solidarity. What China built with the Islamic Republic was something far more cold-blooded, far more calculating, and far more honest in its dishonesty than betrayal. It was a transaction in which China received discounted oil, diplomatic cover, and a useful complicating factor in its strategic competition with the United States, and Iran received the illusion of a powerful ally standing behind it. The transaction has ended, not because China changed, because the transaction stopped being profitable, and the specific moment Beijing chose to end it, not when Iran was strong enough to be dangerous to abandon, not when the international community was watching closely enough to impose costs on the abandonment, but at the precise moment of Iran's maximum vulnerability, when the Islamic Republic needed the transaction most and had the least leverage to demand its continuation. Tells you everything about what the relationship was always built on, and everything about what China's behavior in the current crisis reveals about how Beijing actually calculates its interests when the performance of partnership conflicts with the reality of strategic self-interest. China abandoned Iran at the worst possible moment, and Beijing will not apologize, not because it lacks the diplomatic vocabulary for apology. China's diplomatic apparatus is extraordinarily sophisticated. It could construct an apology that sounded like solidarity, that reframed abandonment as strategic patience, that dressed the calculation in the language of mutual respect and non-interference that has been the aesthetic vocabulary of Chinese foreign policy for decades. It will not apologize, because it does not believe it has done anything that requires apology. Because in Beijing's strategic calculus, which is the calculus of a great power that has never confused sentiment with strategy, what it did was not abandonment, it was optimization. The maximization of Chinese interest at the specific moment when maximization was possible. And in Beijing's worldview, a partner that cannot protect its own interests has no moral claim on a partner that can. The Islamic Republic built its entire external strategy on the assumption that China's need for Iranian oil and China's interest in complicating American strategic calculations would produce a floor of support that would prevent the full international consolidation against Iran that the United States was building toward. That floor has been removed, not gradually, not with warning. At the specific moment when the 14-day oil storage window was closing, when the Supreme Leader had just made his worst decision and received an immediate American response, when the UAE had exposed the last secret military base, when the protests were forming in 6 provincial capitals, when the IRGC soldiers were refusing orders, when the parliament had acknowledged defeat. At that exact moment, Beijing made 3 decisions that together constitute the most consequential act of strategic abandonment in the modern history of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Let us begin with the number that explains why China's abandonment is not just a diplomatic setback, but a terminal event for the Islamic Republic's survival calculation. The number is 35. That is the percentage of Iran's total oil exports that China was absorbing at the peak of the relationship. The heavily discounted, sanction-circumventing, officially unacknowledged flow of Iranian crude that was keeping approximately 35% of Iran's remaining export revenue alive, despite the blockade's impact on the rest. 35% of a revenue stream that was already reduced by 75% from the blockade is a number that looks small in percentage terms and is catastrophic in absolute terms. Because 35% of Iran's remaining oil export revenue, in the context of a treasury hemorrhaging $500 million a day, is the difference between a financial collapse that is theoretical and a financial collapse that is immediate. It is the difference between a regime that can defer the final reckoning by weeks and a regime that cannot defer it past Thursday. When China made its first decision, the quiet, undramatic, officially unannounced but operationally definitive instruction to its state-owned oil importers to suspend purchases of Iranian crude, pending a review of the sanctions compliance posture of the relevant transactions, that 35% disappeared, not reduced, suspended. The tankers that had been delivering Iranian oil to Chinese refineries at the discounted rates that Beijing had been negotiating as the price of its strategic ambiguity stopped receiving loading authorizations. The financial flows that those deliveries generated stopped entering the informal channels through which Iran's treasury had been receiving the fraction of its export revenue that the blockade had not yet fully intercepted. The timing of that suspension instruction, issued 3 days after the UAE's intelligence file was formally transmitted to regional partners and simultaneously with the American response to the Supreme Leader's worst decision, was not coincidental. It was the specific, calculated, precisely timed expression of a strategic decision that Beijing had been preparing for weeks, waiting for the combination of conditions that would allow the suspension to be executed with minimum diplomatic cost and maximum strategic effect. The UAE's exposure of the secret base, with its documentation of nuclear weapons design work at a stage more advanced than Iran's IAEA declarations acknowledged, gave Beijing the specific justification it had been waiting for. Not the real reason for the suspension. The real reason was pure strategic optimization, but the publicly defensible rationale that allowed Beijing to frame its abandonment as a responsible response to Iranian behavior rather than a cold calculation about where Chinese interests now lay. China's second decision was the one that Iranian diplomats, when they are eventually able to speak honestly about this period, will identify as the single most devastating act of the abandonment. Beijing formally notified the IAEA's Board of Governors that China would not use its position to block the formal finding of noncompliance that the American presentation of the UAE's nuclear documentation had initiated. China did not endorse the finding. China did not co-sponsor the American presentation. China maintained the aesthetic of neutrality that its diplomatic culture requires. But neutrality in a process where a blocking position was available and expected, where Iran had specifically and repeatedly asked for Chinese support in preventing the finding, where the diplomatic relationship between Beijing and Tehran had been predicated in part on China's willingness to use its institutional position to protect Iran from exactly this kind of formal international finding. Neutrality in that context is not a neutral act. It is the specific, decisive, consequential choice to remove the protection that the relationship had been understood to provide. The IAEA's Board of Governors passed the noncompliance finding. It passed because China did not block it, and it passed with a margin that reflected the Gulf consolidation, the European alignment, and the specific diplomatic signal that China's non-blocking sent to the governments that had been watching Beijing's position as the indicator of whether full international consolidation against Iran was achievable. When China stepped aside, the governments that had been hedging their positions because they calculated that Chinese protection made full consolidation unachievable updated their calculations simultaneously. The finding passed not just because of the votes that were always going to be there, but because of the votes that moved when the votes that were always going to be there were joined by the absence of the bloc that was supposed to prevent the finding from mattering. China's third decision was the one that removed the last element of the transaction that Iran had been counting on to survive the financial collapse. Beijing formally notified the financial institutions that had been facilitating the informal trade and financial flows between China and Iran, the Hawala networks with Chinese connections, the cryptocurrency conversion pathways with Chinese nodes, the third country banking arrangements that used Chinese-affiliated institutions as intermediaries, that the compliance review of those arrangements was producing findings that required their suspension pending resolution. The language was bureaucratic, the effect was surgical. The informal financial infrastructure through which Iran had been accessing the fraction of its economic relationships that survived both the blockade and the primary sanctions architecture was disconnected, systematically, institution by institution, pathway by pathway, in a process so thorough and so well coordinated with the American Treasury's simultaneous tightening that Iranian financial officials described the combined effect through the diaspora channels that have become the primary pipeline for information that cannot be published inside Iran, as the closing of every remaining financial window simultaneously. The Islamic Republic had been managing its financial survival through the gaps in the sanctions architecture. The gaps required Chinese participation to remain gaps. Without Chinese participation, they were not gaps. They were closed doors that the Islamic Republic was still trying to push through because the alternative, acknowledging that the doors were closed, meant acknowledging that the financial survival strategy was exhausted and that what came next was not a modified version of the current approach, but something categorically different. Now let us understand why China made these three decisions at this specific moment. Because the timing and the sequencing and the specific form that Beijing's abandonment took are not random. They reflect a strategic calculation of extraordinary sophistication that reveals how China thinks about its relationships with states in the developing world, and what that thinking means for every government that has built its external strategy on the assumption of Chinese support. China's relationship with Iran was always built on one foundation and one foundation only: Chinese need for discounted oil. Everything else, the diplomatic cover, the institutional protection, the formal statements of solidarity, the 25-year cooperation agreement that was supposed to represent a generational strategic partnership, was the aesthetic vocabulary that China uses to dress purely transactional relationships in the language of principles-based engagement. The principles were always secondary to the transaction. The transaction was always secondary to Chinese strategic interest. And Chinese strategic interest is defined with a clarity and a consistency that Beijing has maintained across every relationship, every crisis, and every moment of international pressure for decades. China pursues the arrangement that maximizes Chinese benefit at the minimum possible cost to Chinese strategic positioning. For as long as Iranian oil was flowing at discounts significant enough to justify the diplomatic cost of the sanctions circumvention behavior required to access it, the transaction was profitable. For as long as the Islamic Republic retained enough strategic coherence to function as a useful complicating factor in Chinese-American competition, as a problem that consumed American strategic attention, resources, and political capital in ways that reduced American capacity to focus on the Indo-Pacific theater that China considers its primary strategic environment, the relationship served Chinese interests beyond the oil discount. China was not paying much for what it was receiving. The oil was discounted. The diplomatic cost of the protection was manageable. The strategic benefit of the complication was real. That calculation has inverted. The oil is no longer flowing consistently because the blockade's impact and the financial collapse's effect on Iran's production infrastructure have made Iranian crude less reliable as a supply source than the alternative arrangements China can access through Gulf partners who are paradoxically offering China better pricing and more reliability now that they have consolidated their position against Iran. The diplomatic cost of continued protection has increased dramatically because the UAE's exposure of undeclared nuclear weapons design work has made continued Chinese protection of Iran from international accountability a direct challenge to the non-proliferation framework that China needs to maintain credibility on in the context of its own relationships with states it does not want to see acquire nuclear weapons. And the strategic value of Iran as a complicating factor in Chinese-American competition has declined as the Islamic Republic's collapse has moved it from a complex, multidimensional strategic actor that required significant American attention to a failing state whose primary contribution to Chinese-American strategic competition is the distraction of managing its collapse rather than the distraction of managing its capability. The transaction stopped being profitable. The transaction ended. China's abandonment of Iran at the worst possible moment is not a betrayal. It is the precise, calculated, strategically consistent behavior of a great power that has never confused its relationships with its interests, and that ended the relationship at the moment ending it best served the interests. The Iranian response to China's abandonment reveals the specific gap between the Islamic Republic's understanding of what the relationship was and what the relationship actually was. Supreme Leader communications. Filtered through the quarantine that the IRGC command has constructed around him, but detectable in the signals that the diplomatic and intelligence architecture monitoring Tehran continuously processes, expressed what sources describe as genuine shock. Not the performative shock of a government that expected abandonment and is processing it publicly for domestic narrative management. Genuine institutional shock. The shock of an organization whose strategic planning had incorporated Chinese support as a reliable constant, and is now discovering that what it incorporated as a constant was always a variable that China controlled and has just set to zero. The IRGC command's response to the shock has been the response of an institution that has concluded the strategic situation has passed beyond the threshold where conventional responses are available. Internal communications, obtained through the intelligence channels that have been monitoring Iranian command communications, the same channels that detected the Hormuz activation order before it was executed, describe a command environment characterized by what analysts are calling strategic paralysis, not the paralysis of inaction. The paralysis of an institution facing a situation where every available action produces consequences that compound the catastrophe rather than addressing it, and where the institutional framework for making decisions has been so thoroughly compromised by the financial collapse, the personnel crisis, the external military pressure, and now the loss of the last external relationship that provided strategic breathing room, that the decision-making process itself has become unreliable. Strategic paralysis in an institution controlling nuclear program components, missile infrastructure, and proxy networks across the Middle East is not a situation that produces stable deterrence. It is the specific, dangerous, historically documented condition of an institution that has lost its ability to make coherent strategic calculations, and is therefore more, not less, likely to produce the kind of desperate, unilateral, escalatory action that its supreme leader's worst decision has already demonstrated is possible when the institutional constraints on decision-making have dissolved. This is the dimension of China's abandonment that the strategic community is discussing with the most urgency. Not the financial impact. The financial impact is devastating, but is the final acceleration of a collapse that was already terminal. Not the diplomatic impact. The diplomatic impact is significant, but is the final closure of options that were already largely closed. The urgent dimension is what China's abandonment does to the internal decision-making environment of an institution whose paralysis makes it more dangerous precisely because it is less coherent. President Pezeshkian's civilian government has attempted to use China's abandonment as leverage for the argument it has been making to the IRGC command for months. The argument that the diplomatic path is the only remaining path, that the military and strategic options have been exhausted, that the choice is between negotiated transition and unmanaged collapse, and that the window for negotiated transition is narrowing with every development. His eighth request for an urgent meeting with the Supreme Leader has gone unanswered. His proposal for direct diplomatic engagement with the American administration through the Swiss Channel has been blocked by the IRGC command on the grounds that wartime conditions require all external communications to be managed through military channels. His attempts to convene an emergency session of the National Security Council to formally assess the implications of China's abandonment have been met with the institutional obstruction that the IRGC has deployed against every civilian governance initiative since it completed its effective quarantine of the Supreme Leader. The elected government of Iran cannot respond to China's abandonment, cannot assess it institutionally, cannot make the decisions that the abandonment makes urgent, because the institution that controls the decision-making environment has concluded that civilian governance is a threat to its institutional survival rather than a mechanism for managing the national survival crisis that the abandonment has accelerated. The regional response to China's abandonment has been the final confirmation of the consolidation that the UAE's intelligence sharing and the Gulf states' alignment had begun, and that the IAEA noncompliance finding had formalized. When China steps aside, the last major power with both the capability and the historical relationship to provide Iran with any form of meaningful protection from full international pressure has removed itself from that role. What remains is an Islamic Republic facing the combined pressure of American military dominance, Gulf regional consolidation, Israeli existential red lines, European institutional alignment around the noncompliance finding, and Russian strategic silence, without a single major power willing to absorb the diplomatic cost of continued protection. This is the specific configuration of complete international isolation that every previous Iranian crisis was prevented from reaching by the calculation that Chinese and Russian protection created a ceiling on how far international pressure could go. That ceiling no longer exists. China has removed its portion of it. Russia removed its portion when it went silent after the Supreme Leader's worst decision. The ceiling is gone. The pressure has no upper limit defined by great power protection. And the Islamic Republic is experiencing this condition while simultaneously managing financial collapse at 94%, discretionary spending reduction, military fracturing at 89% documented desertion rates, social collapse at 40 million people in a water crisis, political paralysis with a supreme leader who cannot be reached and a president who cannot govern, and the specific psychological weight of an institution that has been exposed, isolated, bankrupted, and abandoned simultaneously. Now, let us address the question that China's abandonment makes the most urgent analytical question in the entire crisis. What does China want from what comes after? Because Beijing did not abandon Iran without a calculation about what the abandonment produces that serves Chinese interests. China does not make strategic moves without a theory of what those moves accomplish. And the specific form of China's abandonment, the oil suspension, the IAEA non-blocking, the financial infrastructure disconnection, executed simultaneously with the UAE's exposure and the American response to the Supreme Leader's decision, suggests a theory of Chinese interest in the post-Islamic Republic landscape that is worth understanding explicitly. China wants to be the indispensable economic partner for whatever government emerges from the collapse of the Islamic Republic. This is the calculation that explains everything about the form and timing of the abandonment. China is not abandoning Iran to punish it. China is not abandoning Iran to help America. China is abandoning the Islamic Republic to position itself as the natural partner of its successor. Because the Islamic Republic's successor, whatever form it takes, whether managed transition or internal coup or negotiated settlement, will emerge into an economy that needs reconstruction investment on a scale that only major powers can provide. It will emerge into a country whose infrastructure has been devastated, whose industrial base has collapsed, whose human capital has been depleted by emigration, and the specific damage that 46 years of mismanagement followed by total economic collapse has done to the educational and professional institutions that produce the human capital required for reconstruction. That reconstruction will require money. The only entities with the money and the interest in providing it are the United States, which will have its own conditions and its own democratic oversight of any reconstruction investment, and China, which will have one condition: access. Access to Iranian markets, Iranian resources, Iranian geographic position, and the Iranian economic relationship that China has always valued but has been forced to access through the expensive, risky, sanctions-circumventing transaction of the Islamic Republic years. A post-Islamic Republic Iran that is desperate for reconstruction investment and free of the ideological constraints that prevented the Islamic Republic from accepting the kind of integrated economic relationship with China that Beijing actually wanted, the kind of above-board, institutionalized, publicly acknowledged relationship, rather than the discounted, circumvented, plausibly deniable transaction, is worth more to China than the continued operation of the transaction it has just ended. China abandoned the Islamic Republic because it has calculated that the successor is a better business partner than the institution being succeeded. This calculation may be correct. It may be the single most cold-blooded and simultaneously most rational strategic assessment of any actor in the entire Iran crisis. It treats 85 million people and the collapse of a civilization as a market opportunity. It prices the suffering of the current moment against the commercial potential of the reconstruction period and finds the trade favorable. It is the calculation of a great power that has never confused sentiment with strategy, and that has concluded, with the patient, unsentimental clarity that characterizes Beijing's foreign policy at its most effective, that the Islamic Republic's value as a transaction partner peaked years ago, and that its value as a predecessor to a more commercially accessible successor is maximized by abandoning it at the moment of its maximum weakness and minimum ability to impose costs on its abandonment. China will not apologize, not because the abandonment was not calculated and cold. It was both, not because the timing was not deliberately chosen for maximum effect. It was. China will not apologize because in Beijing's strategic worldview, which is the worldview that has taken China from a developing country to the world's second largest economy in 4 decades, through exactly this kind of unsentimental optimization of every relationship and every transaction, what it did was not a moral failure requiring apology. It was a strategic success requiring documentation for future reference. The Islamic Republic built its external strategy on a relationship that was always a transaction. It mistook the transaction for solidarity. It mistook the Chinese need for discounted oil for strategic commitment. It mistook the IAEA protection for principled support of sovereignty. It mistook the 25-year cooperation agreement for a generational partnership. And it made all of these mistakes because it needed to believe them. Because the alternative, the accurate assessment that China's support was contingent on Chinese interest and would end the moment Chinese interest pointed elsewhere, was too destabilizing to incorporate into the strategic planning of an institution already managing financial collapse, military fracturing, and social disintegration simultaneously. The moment Chinese interest pointed elsewhere arrived in June 2026. China's oil suspension happened, the IAEA non-blocking happened, the financial infrastructure disconnection happened. All 3 simultaneously, all 3 without warning, all 3 without apology. And the Islamic Republic, which built its survival strategy on the floor that Chinese support was supposed to provide, is now discovering what the floor was always made of. Not solidarity, not principles, not partnership. Transaction. And the transaction is over. The oil is not flowing. The IAEA protection is gone. The financial channels are closed. The floor has been removed. And 85 million people who were not party to the transaction are living inside the consequences of its termination. Beijing calculated perfectly. Beijing executed precisely. Beijing positioned itself for the reconstruction relationship that the collapse it has just accelerated will eventually make possible. And Beijing will not apologize because in the strategic worldview that produced this calculation, there's nothing to apologize for. There is only what serves Chinese interest. And right now, what serves Chinese interest is the specific silence of a great power that has stepped aside, closed the door behind it, and is waiting for the noise on the other side of the door to stop before it opens a new one. That noise is 85 million people. And Beijing is very patient. If what you just heard gave you a clearer understanding of what China's abandonment actually means, not the diplomatic language version, not the one paragraph mention in a broader Iran story, but the full strategic calculation behind 3 simultaneous decisions that together constitute the most consequential act of geopolitical abandonment in the modern Middle East, then share this with one person who is trying to understand it. The analysis in this community has been ahead of the mainstream on every major Iran development. China's role in what comes next is the dimension most people are not adequately analyzing. Be ahead of it. Share it before the mainstream catches up. Drop your answer in the comments to the question that China's abandonment makes the most important question in the entire crisis. Beijing has positioned itself as the indispensable reconstruction partner for whatever comes after the Islamic Republic. It has abandoned the transaction to position for the relationship. But here is what nobody is asking clearly enough. When the reconstruction begins, when the new government of Iran is negotiating its economic future, will it accept Beijing's terms knowing exactly what Beijing did at the worst possible moment? Or does the abandonment create the specific political dynamic in Iranian society that prevents any post-Islamic Republic government from accepting the Chinese reconstruction relationship that Beijing has been positioning for? Comment below. Because that question, whether China's cold calculation about the reconstruction relationship survives the political reality of what the abandonment did to Iran's population and its memory, is the question that determines whether Beijing's strategy actually worked or whether it executed perfectly and arrived at the wrong answer. subscribe, because the window between China's abandonment and whatever Iran's response to that abandonment produces is the most analytically rich period in this entire crisis. And you need to be watching when the silence on Beijing's side of the door ends and the new transaction begins,